My daughter Edie first came out to us as trans when she was 6 years old.
Some people may think that so-called Therians and Quadrobists are people who think they're animals. Therianthropy is a belief and an identity. It's a community with teamwork and love and a connection no one can take away.
Personas are used in any furry-related setting like social media, chat rooms, video games, or in real-life environments like in-person meetups.
What we understand as identity has dramatically shifted recently. I'm not sure if you've noticed. But the question of who am I is a really important one at this point. And I just never thought at this point in my life I would be having to involve in ministry, explaining to people and my children the difference between a boy and a girl and why that's not hateful. But this comes from somewhere. All of this has an origin, it has a story, it has a history, and it's its own religious movement, all on its own. It's an ideology that's been lurking for centuries. And one of the best books I've ever read on this is Strange New World by Carl Trueman, who happens to be one of the people that I am interviewing today. Along with Carl is his friend Todd Pruitt, who is a theologian and pastor. Both of them have a podcast that they co-host together called Mortification of Spin, which I'm very annoyed that I never knew about until recently. But this is overall what I wanted to have them on today to talk about this movement, to talk about the historical origins. I asked them about expressive individualism. What is that? Why is it important? We talk about a topic called the social imagination. Carl and Todd break that down. Why is that important? And why is that different from a social construct? Let's see, where else did we go? I still write notes on this handy dandy thing called paper. It's my little doodle. Okay. I've always been very interested in understanding the origin and the history of these things. So I asked them both about the Enlightenment era. That's something I come across a lot in my research and understanding these movements. We do kind of touch on transcendentalism. I really want to do a deep dive on this at some point. Like Ralph Waldo Emerson, he's one of the fathers of New Thought. The transcendental movement is very important to understand society. But along with the transcendental movement, there is this other movement called Romanticism. This is really where Carl, he focuses in on this in his book about the Romantic era. And one of the main figures of that era is Rousseau. And you've probably never heard of these people before, but they're very important to understand where we got to today. We've come to a point where our emotions and our sense of self have defined what reality is, not the other way around. And these movements and these people have helped, can give us insight on how we have got to where we are today. So we talk about that. We talk about so many more things. Halfway through the interview, you're going to notice that we talk more about what I call neognosticism. It's like this animosity towards the body. And it ties into everything that we're saying about identity, because it's not your body that defines who you are. It's how you feel on the inside. Then we segue over into a very important topic, in my opinion, a societal trend amongst the youth of our day, which is furries. The furry fandom world is no longer niche. When I was growing up, this was a very strange, odd thing that people did. Now it's growing in popularity. It's all over social media. And I would guess that most of your kids understand what this is. Maybe they make fun of it, or maybe they're a part of it, but they know what it is. When it comes to the furry topic, I want to do a whole separate video on this trend right now, what it is, where it came from, and really what the underbelly is of this world. There are people that are in the furry group who just like dressing up. Those do exist. They don't really have any ulterior motives, and they just enjoy the community. But you have other people that are a part of this community that they don't have such innocent motives. And this is something I really want to look into and have a fair analysis of, because this does play into identity, but this is something that is growing and is affecting a lot of kids today. So that ties into the topic today of identity and really why a lot of people are attracted to these kinds of groups. Now, there's a lot more that we talk about, but that should give you an idea of what we talk about in today's interview. Carl and Todd are great resources for you, so please be sure to check out the description for more information. Please follow them, read their books, read their blogs, read their essays, visit their websites. I really want you guys to have really good resources to refer to. We should have lots of resources that we look to for biblical support, for cultural ideas, how to handle these things for apologetics. I hope that you enjoy this interview, and I hope that it really does bless you. I have two very special guests on today. I'm very excited to have them on. I have Todd Pruitt and Carl Trueman. I am so excited to have you guys on. Thank you for coming on my channel today.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
Yeah. So first, I'm going to let you guys introduce yourself. Todd, let's start with you. Who are you and what's your background?
I'm a pastor. I've been involved in vocational church ministry since I guess I was 19 and an intern in my home church. I was involved in youth ministry for about 11 years and then became a senior pastor of a church. I was raised Southern Baptist, educated in Southern Baptist institutions, and 12 years I transferred my ordination from Southern Baptist to the Presbyterian Church in America. So for 12 years, I've been pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And it's been a great place to be. My wife and I have 3 adult children, and my life is pretty much consumed with just being a local church pastor, trying to keep Carl Trueman on the right track, and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's who I am. I love theology. I love to, because I'm a pastor, I think through a lot of the issues that Carl's academic work touches on, issues of identity and that kind of thing. I'm dealing with that stuff all the time because Christians have lots of questions and lots of conflicts, even within their families over some of these issues. So
Yeah, and we'll get
Carl
more
and I've
into
known,
that.
my family and I moved to Philadelphia back in 2009. And I met Carl because I had just read a collection. Before we moved, I'd read a collection of some of his essays, and I really liked it, and got together with him for breakfast, and we just kind of formed a friendship from there, and have been doing a podcast called Mortification of Spin for Carl. I've been here for 12 years. We were doing it for at least a year and a half or so before I moved here. So I mean, it's close to 14 years old now.
I'm guessing 14 to 15 years.
Mortification of Spin is
I
the
had
podcast.
no idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So guys, be sure to check out this podcast. I was honored to be a guest on this podcast. It's filled with a lot of good stuff that I think so many people need to know. I'll leave a link in the description for you guys to check out. And Carl, tell us about yourself. What's your background?
Yeah, well, I'm an Englishman by background, but I've been in the States since 2001.
And a citizen.
And I'm now a citizen. In fact, I have both passports. I have a British passport and an American passport.
Yeah.
I teach at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania. I'm also a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. And this year, I'm the Bush Family Visiting Research Fellow at the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government at the University of Notre Dame. So many hats. By training, I'm a Reformation/post-Reformation intellectual historian. By quirk of fate, I've become a sort of cultural commentator over the last 5, 6, 7 years, partly due to some of the crazy things that have been going on in our wider culture. But married for 35 years last Saturday.
Oh, congrats.
Father of 2 sons, grandfather to beautiful 3-year-old little girl.
So a perfect 3-year-old little girl. Yes.
Sorry?
A perfect 3-year-old little girl.
A perfect 3-year-old little girl who loves her grandpa dearly.
Yes. All grandchildren to the grandparents are perfect. I can attest. Yes, I love grandparents. So, but no, it's an honor to have you guys on. I'm very glad for this interview. I feel like when I was writing my book, I've mentioned to you this to you a few times, and I think I mentioned it to my audience, but um, part of my book was an amalgamation of different ideas that helped me put together what I saw in the cultural sphere as well. And your book was a big part of that. One of the probably the most vulnerable chapter I wrote had a lot of Trumanisms, if you will, like a lot of your writings, a lot of the things that I got from your book to kind of help me understand where we got today and how we got there. So both of you guys, we're going to go back and forth. We're going to bounce some ideas off. But first, let's start with something you mentioned, Todd, earlier about identity. Let me ask you this. So you're a pastor. You deal with a lot of this. You see it on the front lines, if you will. Um, I want to ask you, what kinds of things are you seeing about how people are struggling with who they are? It could be gender, especially gender, the gender identity, who they are on the inside. What have you seen that has shifted the last few years from people just struggling with who am I, who is God, to who am I as like a species, who am I as a gender? Tell me those kinds of things that you're seeing. And then, Carl, I'll add a follow-up question for you on this.
Well, things have come so rapidly. When I was a youth pastor in the 90s, in the 1990s, I never dealt with questions about identity. Now,
Yeah.
sometimes I would speak into issues of, I would regularly speak into issues of sexual ethics. But in terms of human identity, the T, for instance, in the LGBTQ thing, it just never came up. It was just never on the radar. And now I, like pastors everywhere, have had to really do some crash courses on identity issues because we're asked about it so often, and not just by kids in our churches, but by parents, by young adults, parents dealing with confusion that they have in their kids. And so this has become a major feature, I think, of a pastor's work. And it makes sense. I mean, we're dealing with biblical categories here. Now, when I was in high school in the 1980s, I didn't, we weren't taught a detailed doctrine of creation. We were just told, for instance, homosexuality is a sin. I had categories for cross-dressing, but not transgenderism.
Yeah.
And Carl and I have talked about this, but I didn't have a single unbelieving friend that didn't think those things were wrong. Well, all of
Ah.
that's changed now. As Carl might, say from Charles Taylor, the cultural imaginary, has changed. And so people are coming with all
What
these
do you mean
different,
by cultural? Can you
just,
define
just
cultural imaginary?
Carl can go into it further, but it's just it's kind of the cultural ether in which we live, the presuppositions that people operate out of. And so in the 1980s in Houston, Texas, your typical unbeliever that you'd meet in a typical suburban high school would say, "Oh yeah, homosexuality is wrong." They might not know Jesus from a hole in the wall, but they had kind of a construct for how most people thought about these things. Well, that's been entirely changed. Now, the healthy thing that people like me, pastors, are having to do is actually instruct our church with a robust doctrine of creation, which I didn't get. And I guess because the felt need just wasn't there. But now we're
Uh-huh.
needing to, people are now for the, last couple of decades for the first time saying, well, why is that wrong? And why does God say no to that? Um, and, and so we're more and more pastors, if they're doing their job right, are having to instruct their churches in a robust doctrine of creation, to spend a lot of time in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, to help lay the groundwork for some of these things. The thing I've said before is that the church has a much better answer to those questions, and we have a much better story to tell than the world tells. The challenge is that the world's story can be summed up in little sound bites. Love is love, and can be put on a little sign in the front yard. In this house, we believe in science, or whatever. Their story is very easy to tell. It's immediately emotionally appealing. We have a far better story, but it involves complexities. And you've got to listen, and you've got to learn, you've got to do some reading because it's the true story. the challenge for churches and the challenge for pastors is how to really instruct, beginning in childhood. The children's ministry director at my church wrote a little booklet for the youngest children on you're either a boy or a girl. Now, I never needed that. Your generation, I'm sure, never needed that when you were little kids. But now all of a sudden, we've got to be telling our 3-year-olds, if you're a girl, you will be a woman. If you're a boy, you will be a man. And again, it's positive from the standpoint of we should be teaching this stuff all along. But now we finally are out of necessity. So these issues, I think one of the reasons why Carl was pushed kind of into writing so much on these topics is because the need demanded it. We have to, because the confusion is so great.
Yes, it reminds me of one of those really, really simple topics that you've just believed and have learned, oh, this is true your whole life. Like 2 + 2 is 4, right? Like something very simple. A boy is a boy for this reason, a girl is a girl for this reason. And you're like, oh, okay. Right. And you clearly see that reality has aligned with this very simple thing. But then all of a sudden you get this wave of people coming up against saying, no, 2 + 2 is not 4. It's not 4. And you're like, yes, it is. Here's how. And they're like, no, no, no. And they're trying to redefine it. And so it's like you have to go back and learn basic reality and learn like the intricacies of something so simple before that, like biology.
Biology
Like
is
you have to
bigotry
know.
now. Biology is bigotry.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it's like you have to go and actually be educated in quite simple things, like overeducated almost, just to explain to this person denying a basic reality why that's not true. So with that being said, let's bounce over to you, Carl. Now, for those of you that don't know, I probably mentioned this in the introduction. Carl's written a few books. One of them, there's 2. There's the longer title, what is it? Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self.
That's the one. Yes.
Yeah. And then the other one is Strange New World. I always want to
Yep.
say Brave New World, but it's Strange New World.
Al Mohler got the title wrong, so don't worry about it too much,
Well, that's okay. It's a good play off of Brave New World. And so in my head, it's brilliant actually. But in your book, Strange New World, this was the book that really kind of had a chokehold on me in a good way, because it blew the lid off of me, helping me understand the why and the how. Now, what Carl's talking about in a practical sense, things that we are all dealing with, whether we want to ignore them or not, it's in the news every day. It's not going away. He mentioned a few things that we're dealing with. Now, you are very, very valuable here because you kind of you piece together the how and the why, like where this came from, right? And so Todd mentioned cultural imagination. And then there's something else you talk about that intertwines with this, which is expressive individualism. I would love for you to tell my audience about these 2 words and why they are relevant to everything we're talking about today.
Well, Taylor's precise term actually is social imaginary, not cultural imaginary, though the explanation Todd gave was just a very good one of what the social imaginary means, and that it's really Charles Taylor's way of getting at the idea that most of what we believe about the world, we don't believe it because we've read books and been persuaded by arguments. It's more intuitive than that. We imagine the world to be a certain way, and the reason we imagine the world to be that way is often nothing to do with proofs, for example. Most of us don't believe in God because we've been convinced by the ontological proof of God's existence. We've had a good experience in church, or we grew up in a Christian family. There are other things that shape the way we believe and we imagine the world to be. So it's Taylor's general term for, I think, what would apply at any given point in history. You have a social imaginary that shapes people, presses people towards thinking, imagining the world to be a certain kind of world. The world of modernity, the world in which we now live in, is a world where the social imaginary is very much consonant with what we call expressive individualism. And expressive individualism is a term coined by the American sociologist Robert Bellah way back in the 1980s to capture what he thought was distinctive about the way particularly Americans thought about themselves. So I think we can generalize that to the West in general today. And the idea was that If you ask somebody who they are, our intuitive, instinctive way of responding to that today is to move inwards, to think about our feelings and to define ourselves in terms of those feelings. If you imagine, let's say in the 12th century, you'd asked somebody, who are you? They'd probably have said, I'm the blacksmith, or I'm an inhabitant of this village, or I'm a knight in shining armor, or I'm a damsel in distress. You'd have had these sort of external identities. Today, when you ask somebody who they are, you might get an answer such as, well, I'm a very sensitive person, or I'm a spiritual person. Or even if we move into the realms of sort of highly charged identity, you might say, well, I'm gay, or I'm straight, or I'm bi, or I'm trans. What all of those answers, both the less controversial and the more controversial ones, have in common is this: they all ground our sense of who we are in terms of something inside, our feelings, our desires. And expressive individualism is really the idea that I can only then be truly me if I'm allowed to act outwardly in accordance with those feelings I have inwardly. And that has all kinds of ramifications. It means, for example, let's say a gay, somebody who's struggling with their identity and they think they're gay goes to see Todd as their pastor, and Todd says to them, well, actually, homosexuality is a sin. You can't act on these desires. In fact, these desires in themselves are wrong. You need to sort of mortify them. You need to put them to death. That person's going to hear Todd as not as offering good pastoral counsel. That person's going to hear Todd as saying, you're not going to be allowed to be the person you really are. You're going to be, to use the trendy language, I'm going to erase you. I'm going to make you invisible. I'm going to deny you your authenticity. So expressive individualism, we can see that when it becomes the dominant way of thinking about yourself, can become very damaging. I mean, it's important to qualify it and say, feelings are important, that the Psalms are full of feelings. It's not that those of us who want to press back against the modern social imaginary are against feelings. It's just a question of the authority you grant to those feelings.
And I was just going to add, in the PCA, we went through a controversy a few years ago over a ministry and a conference called Revoice, which adopted so-called side B homosexuality. What their stated purpose was is to hold to the traditional biblical sexual ethic that sexual intimacy is only between a husband and a wife in marriage. Okay, good so far. But they granted a level of identity to these homosexual desires, and the PCA, fought against this. We made some real ground in getting a lot of this out of our denomination. But what was interesting, it is right to Carl's point. A former PCA pastor who had started a church in San Francisco some years ago, a PCA church, they pulled out of the PCA, and now they're a fully affirming, as in homosexuality, church in San Francisco. But the stated reason for that began with the very thing that Carl was talking about, which is they began to grant homosexual desire with one's identity, and therefore it becomes pastorally cruel to say you can't live according to your identity, and that's where it crumbled. The issue of identity is incredibly important. And that's why many homosexuals are and trans individuals, whatever, are very motivated to take it out of the realm of a sinful desire, obviously, and raise it to a level of personal identity.
Yes.
It plays
Okay,
on
yeah.
emotions. It plays on a compassion, that hopefully most pastors possess, but divorced from biblical discernment can be disastrous.
Yeah, and it seems to be a correction, an overcorrection on many levels with the pastors who maybe weren't so compassionate, especially the last few decades. The hellfire, brimstone, damnation kind of pastors that would um, not necessarily be the first people that you'd want to tell, hey, I'm struggling with this. So, I mean, I understand that. And we're going to get into later how church culture has kind of shifted from this in a lot of ways. I have a follow-up question for you, Carl, that I can hear some people asking, and this is something I'm wondering myself. You mentioned social imagination and you defined it. What is the difference between the social imagination and a social construct?
Yeah, well, they're really referring to two different things. Social imaginary is a broad term talking about the collection of beliefs, rituals, practices. Social imaginary in some ways is as broad as the culture itself. When you're talking about something as a social construct, you're talking there about things that the society has sort of put together and made seem real, even though they're actually constructed. Now, clearly, there's an overlap between the two. One might say that the expressive individual is to some extent a social construct. The notion of being a homosexual is a social construct. So there's an overlap between the two, but really by and large we're doing two different things with those two terms.
Okay. Yeah. So for people that don't know, social construct is basically the idea that what we believe about ourselves, about society, is socially constructed. Like the idea, for example, of gender and marriage and the way the nuclear family. Like these are social constructs that need to be deconstructed and rebuilt. And there are some things that are social constructs that are not inherently bad, like currency, like the way that we, for example, like pay money at a store. That's a construct that's been socially engineered for society to run smoothly. So not all social constructs are bad, but the difference I'm gathering is that there are things that Carl's defining as far as like what a social imagination is that can be aligned with reality and fine. But to apply a social construct to something that is objectively true is where we would cry foul, in other words. So
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're saying really is that social construct is how we would talk about individual things. Social imaginary is looking at the big, broad dynamic of how all those things interplay with each other.
And the
yeah.
idea of social constructs is that if all something is a social construct, then it's dispensable. Once we learn new things. And so you have, for instance, the notion that, well, the nuclear family, a husband and a wife and, God willing, children, that's just a social construct. There's nothing inherently or metaphysically underlying to that. It's just a social construct. And so we can do away with it if we want to. As we, evolve, we can just do away with it rather than being
Okay.
something that's creational. It's just a
Mhm.
social construct.
Yeah. So these terms are important to know to kind of understand where we're going to go later. Okay, Todd, let me bring it back to you for just a second. So in your insight, in your experience and things that you've had to deal with, uh, what would you say to the historical context that's brought all of this together? Because again, I've read Carl's book, but many people that are watching haven't. And there's actually like a historical lineage that we can look to that sheds light onto how we've gotten here today. And before we got on, you were talking about, postmodernism, the redefinition of truth. We were talking about Romanticism. I'm wondering what you have to offer to my audience in regards of starting us off with this topic.
Well, I think first of all, I'm asked routinely about these kinds of questions. I have to, I answer questions that come from people directly who themselves are struggling with feeling like they're in the wrong body, or how I'm attracted to people of the same sex. How could God give me that if it wasn't good? I'm dealing with those kinds of questions, as I figure pretty much every other pastor is. Part of the question is, where did this come from? The question that Carl poses in his work is, how did we get to the place where a statement like, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, how did that become something that, quote, makes sense? And anymore, that's a statement that, we would say it doesn't make sense, but it makes sense in our, social imaginary. That's now
Mm-hmm.
a question that makes sense. And one thing I hadn't really seen, and where Carl's book really helped a lot of pastors, and I've had so many conversations with pastors since his book Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self came out, um, and this is where it was helpful pastorally, is I was able to say, look, here's where our story begins. It begins with creation. But really, the presuppositions that have made these new struggles so possible, we can kind of pinpoint a lot of it in history. You go back to the Romantics, Rousseau, and these philosophers and poets that kind of changed the rules on how we think about ourselves and how we talk about ourselves. And where that's been helpful apologetically in terms of my task as a pastor
Mhm.
is, again, in helping some people who are struggling with some of these things, saying, look, the reason why you're struggling with this is because you're made in a certain way. The other reason why you're
Mhm.
struggling with this is because, like everybody else, you've grown up in a culture that holds to certain presuppositions about what it means to be human that contradict with the story that reality is actually grounded in. And this is why reading like good intellectual histories on these kinds of things is helpful in our apologetic task, because we're not ignorant about where this stuff has come from primarily. We can name it, we can identify it, and talk about reasons why this became a part of the culture and why now it's just a part of the ether that we live in. And so that's been helpful to me as a pastor in Sunday school classes I've taught, as well as just in personal conversations, is I keep, I'm able to contrast, okay, here's the story that you have learned from the world, but here's the older, better story, that's about God's creation, that's confirmed in nature, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
And that's been helpful. It's been especially helpful because these are conversations that are very sensitive emotionally. You can't just anymore wave a hand and say, shame a person because they're struggling with this. You need to actually engage. I mean, my assumption is that if somebody comes and talks to their pastor about something as sensitive about their sexual desires, and they're concerned about it, then that deserves some real good reflection from their pastor. That deserves
Mhm.
a good, compassionate, but clear and well-read response from their pastor. And so pastors have a responsibility to know this stuff. And,
Mhm.
and I'll tell you, since in the PCA, and I know among a lot of conservative Southern Baptists as well, who've been educating themselves on this stuff, and Carl's book was a big piece of that. You've got now more PCA pastors that can talk about the Romantic era and Rousseau, et cetera, than ever were, 3 or 4 years ago. But that's good.
Yeah.
When apologetics are done well, it rises to the level of where the cultural flood is coming to. It rises to that watermark, and that's
Yeah.
what it should be. Um,
Yeah,
and
it's
so,
funny. Rousseau was like a blip in my psychology class in high
right,
school, and now I'm like,
right,
"Oh, look,
yeah,
he's actually a lot more
yeah.
important than I thought."
Yeah, we covered Rousseau in my
Yeah.
intro philosophy class when I was at University of Houston, and in a literature class I took. But beyond that, in terms, I remember a philosophy professor talking about some of the monumental shifts that happened in the Romantic era. I remember that, but it wasn't until recently where I saw, connecting the dots between how we think about and how we talk about ourselves, our identity, our
Yeah.
personhood, and so.
Yeah.
You know, pastors just don't. A pastor doesn't have to doesn't have to have a PhD in philosophy or sociology or that kind of thing. But we don't have an excuse anymore for being, well informed and well equipped with some sound answers, to these
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah. So there's a lot there to go off of. Okay, Carl, I'm gonna bounce it back to you, and I'm gonna ask a follow-up on this because here we are talking about like, hey, this comes from somewhere, and it's kind of part of who we are as a church, as a nation here in the West. And one thing that I'm noticing about a lot of this is that a lot of it came like post Enlightenment, like from the Enlightenment era. And from that, we keep talking about like, oh, the romantic era. Let's define this. So let me ask, tell us about what was going on in the world during the Enlightenment and after the Enlightenment, and if this romantic era that we keep talking about in Rousseau, this dude that we keep talking about, tell us all about these definitions. Who is this? Why is this significant? And give us some ideas, some words, some things to grasp about this era that sounds very familiar to our ears today.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a huge question, Melissa. And of course, there
It's
are
a big question. Take your time.
numerous angles on that. First of all, there's an intellectual genealogy. We've already alluded to that with Rousseau, Romantics, etc. And we might characterize the intellectual genealogy on one level by saying, in Europe after the Reformation, what happens in the late 16th and then on into the 17th and on into the 18th century is you're really struggling to find a new basis for a stable society. The church has given that right up until the Reformation, where you just had the one church in Western Europe. You had a fairly straightforward basis for understanding how society could be unified. It's one of the reasons why, for example, Jews are so badly persecuted in Europe in the later Middle Ages, because they don't fit the Christian paradigm. Everybody is a member of the church, everybody is a member of the state. That's the way that society is kept stable, it's kept moral, it's regulated. What do you do with those who aren't Christians? They become a problem in that context. After the Reformation, when you have this fragmentation really of the church, we could say Christianity ceases to be, institutional Christianity ceases to provide the solid basis for society. And so you have this quest, we might say a quest for certainty or a quest for solidity that takes place from the 16th century onwards. Descartes is one of the famous philosophical examples of this, where he takes the view he's going to doubt everything except he gets that one thing he can't doubt, and his basis for certainty is his own existence, the existence of himself as an individual. Well, you have the quest for certainty, but you also have the quest, I would say, for morality as well. What is it? How do you find a basis for morality among individuals? And that's where you have philosophers such as Immanuel Kant and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, these 18th century Enlightenment figures, attempting to develop ways of grounding morality in something that isn't, as they would say, as fragmented and arbitrary as what Christianity has become, but is yet transcendent. And Rousseau finds it really in nature. If we can get back to nature, if we can get back to pristine human nature, get back behind the way society and culture has perverted us, then we can build a moral society. So you have that intellectual genealogy, and you'll notice, the thing that Rousseau and Descartes have in common is they're moving inwards. They're trying to get back beyond, to use your phrase of earlier on, they're trying to get back beyond social constructs to that original core of certainty for Descartes, human nature for Rousseau. So there's an intellectual genealogy. There's also, I think, for want of a better term, we might say a more sociological genealogy as well. With the rise of cities, with the rise of industrialization in the late 18th and on into the 19th centuries, other things that were once solid are now being disrupted as well. People no longer are born, live, marry, die and get buried in the same parish. You might be born in one place, you might move somewhere else for work, and you might move somewhere else when you come towards the end of your life. Location becomes much more fluid. Careers become much more fluid. Melissa, if you'd been born, this isn't to be sexist, but if you'd been born in my home village in Gloucestershire in 1200, I'd have known exactly what you were going to do from the moment you were born. You were going to be the wife of a peasant, you were going to have lots of children, and then you were going to die in the same village where you were born. If I'd been born in that village, hey, I'm going to be a peasant farm worker. I don't get to choose my career. All that changes. And when you think about that that too throws notions of certainty and solidity into some confusion. And in some ways, if I'm growing up in England in the 18th, 19th century, and I moved from my village to the city, and my dad was a blacksmith, but I'm a bookbinder, what is the one constant in my life? It's what goes on in here. It's the inner me that becomes the constant. So you don't have to be reading Rousseau to become a person who looks inward for their identity. Rousseau is an intellectual manifestation of that, but the very fluidity or liquidity of life pushes people inwards. And of course, that has intensified in the modern age to the point where now technology develops so fast that most of us have a constant feeling of the world slipping away from us, a constant feeling that nothing is certain. The website one of the reasons I was slightly late joining the podcast was they've recently changed the settings menu on my computer, and I struggle every time I get on to find it now. It worked for years. Now they've changed it. Suddenly the world is slipping away from me.
Yeah.
And so there's also this material or sociological dynamic. And the net result is we have less and less external markers that give us our sense of identity. And we become more and more dependent in some ways on our inner resources to tell us who we are.
Okay, yeah. So tell me though. So some people, maybe they're watching and they're like, so what? What's the big deal? What's the problem with me trusting who I am on the inside? What's so wrong about my emotional identity, my true authentic self, guiding my reality and truth? What is wrong with that?
Well, there are two ways to respond to that. First of all, I'd want to say it's not an entirely wrong way of thinking about it. If I were to go back to one of the great things, it seems to me, about what I call the psychologizing of the self, this move inwards is, for example, we now take mental illness much more seriously than we once did. We have, in many ways, become much more sensitive to that inner space and the things that go on there. And that's a gain. That's definitely a net gain. You look at somebody like Rousseau. Now, okay, Rousseau gets a lot wrong, but one of the things in his sort of fulminating against society and its hierarchies, he actually lays the groundwork for recapturing something of the biblical notion that we're all made in God's image. Born poor or born rich, it doesn't change your intrinsic value. So, first of all, I'd want to say, don't hear me saying this is an unmitigated problem. Primarily, I'm describing what's gone on. Where it becomes a problem, I think, is this, that we are creatures of a certain nature. To say that some things are social constructs is not to say that everything is a social construct. So I would say that my relationship to my children, that's not a social construct. That has a biological component to it. I don't know whether you had this with you have children, Melissa, right?
Oh, yes, I have two. I have a 15-year-old and an 11-year-old girls.
Well, I don't know if you remember, but when my wife and I were younger and our kids were in the church nursery, my wife would be able to hear our kids crying in the nursery, discerning it from among other kids for no apparent reason. I couldn't hear it, but she was aware it was going on. And I'd be inclined to say that bond, that biological bond, it's not arbitrary. The significance that society typically grants to that bond is not arbitrary. So I would say to the person who says, well, what's wrong with all this? I would say, well, there are many things that are good about it, but let us not allow it to ace everything. Let us not allow it to effectively eliminate any notion of human nature. And that's particularly important for Christians, of course, because we're committed to the idea that all human beings are made in the image of God. So it's really not an option for Christians to say, hey, everything's a social construct. And I would say, we're always, when you think about what it means to be a human being, I would say our dependency is not a human construct. When you gave birth to your girls, Melissa, it was not a social construct that they were utterly dependent upon you. for months, years even, for their survival. That's not something that society has just conjured up over time. That's a reality grounded in physical, biological reality. So I would say, the story is not an entirely bad one. And I would hate to be read, as I have been read by some people, saying this is all bad. No, I don't want to go back to the 12th century. No antibiotics, no flush toilets, no painkillers. That's all good stuff as far as I'm concerned. But I would want to say that let us not, in affirming some of the gains, let us not allow this idea that, hey, I can be whoever I think I am to override, those aspects of, as Todd was pointing to early on, creation and nature. They are not social constructs.
And I would say also that what Carl is describing, going back to the Romantic era, we see it get into the church by the time we get to the late 19th, early 20th century. So, for instance, you had certain secular sources. Margaret Mead comes to mind, the very famous anthropologist who went to Samoa, and basically she found what she was looking for. She was blinded by confirmation bias, as later historians came to realize, that in Samoa, this kind of, pristine island culture that wasn't corrupted by Western notions of society and morality, and everybody just had sex with everybody, and they were happy about it, and it was wonderful. And she wrote this study that became very, very seminal work in anthropology in the early 20th century. Of course, we come to find out her research was beyond shoddy. Now, the point I'm making is that there were liberal Protestant denominations that appealed to Margaret Mead and others to begin deconstructing, for among other things, the biblical sexual ethic, and to begin to say that those things, you see, are just constructs. You go to the home of the noble savage, and they don't have they're free, they're pure, they're free of those things. And so that's where the theory of the classroom, or the theory of the philosophy or anthropology department in one generation gets into the church eventually in another generation. And suddenly all the presuppositional groundwork has changed, and it becomes this new thing.
But you don't have to go to the wild and the wonderful to see how this affects Jews. Well, think of the hymn. I can't remember the first time, but there's a hymn where you have that ending line, you ask me how I know he lives. He lives within my heart. That is classic grounding certainty in feelings. Much better is Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. That's much more orthodox.
That's better theology.
Well, this is fascinating because people listening they take a lot of this for granted, right? And there's so much to bounce off of with this, because it's this whole idea of the emotions kind of guiding what we relay as true and real and experiential. And something that I kind of wrote a little bit about, and something I really want to dig more into, it's just I don't know if my brain can handle it right now, but it's the transcendentalists as well. You have this idea, like, okay, so for example, if I were to define, tell me if I'm correct, if I were to define Romanticism in one word, I would sum it up perhaps with emotion. And if I were to define transcendentalism in a word, I would perhaps sum that up with self. And it's like both of them kind of dance this dance of how to define truth and how to look at things and say, oh, yes, that is true.
Perhaps you could summarize it by saying these things point towards an impatience with external authority. That external authority is typically seen as hostile. You see that, now, in saying this, I do not want to belittle the real, genuine felt struggles of people with gender dysphoria. But the ideology of the trans movement, the ideology is very much that of a repudiation of external authority, whether it be the socially constructed notion of male and female in society, or that of the physical body, the sexed nature of the physical body. And that's what binds, for example, modern trans ideology together with some of the romantics, the more radical romantics like Percy Bysshe Shelley or William Blake. It's their particular beef is with the external authority of religion. The beef today now is with the external authority of the body. We see that in, let's not just pick on transgenderism, because with transhumanism in general, this idea that the body somehow limits me and inhibits me. And the
Yes.
body is
Yeah.
a problem to be overcome, not a given limit to be accepted. And that's where I think, the romantics and the transcendentalists, you could bind them together and say, whether it's emphasizing emotions or self, you're going to be tilting towards an antipathy towards external authority, something else telling me who I am or what I should feel.
There's this whole bandwagon question that people kind of get on, right? Like, what is a woman? I always wonder, like, why can't you ask what is a man? Like, why is it just females? Anyway, but like it has to, if you play the movie forward and you're talking about identity and the basis of reality, one thing that I run into in my circles, like especially with the new thought, and a lot of new age, there's some, I can't even say it's fringe new age, but there are people out there that believe there are other beings that they can identify as, like otherkin. Otherkin are people who identify as a fictional character, not fictional, a fictional or fantasy character, like a hobbit, a fairy, and that's how they identify, a
Right.
mermaid.
Right.
Yeah, and then you have the idea that people identify as animals, that they truly feel that they were born as the wrong species. They actually could do what we would call playing dress up, right? They want to be a dog or a bird or whatever it is. I would love to get your guys' thoughts. Todd, let's start with you. Tell me your general thoughts on everything I just said and how everything that we've been talking about is like a religious movement that kind of dismantles how we interpret truth and our identities.
Mhm. I mentioned Margaret Mead earlier, and her project was going on during, the rise of critical theory in Frankfurt,
Yes.
Germany. They were it was all going on at the same time in this kind of philosophical, intellectual stew that was going on, and there were some serious thinkers among them, but part of the project was a denial of human nature. And so you'll find with Mead and others a hostility towards even the term, the idea of there being human nature. Because what does that do? If there's human nature, then I'm accountable to something outside of my feelings about myself. There's something that speaks to me and helps define me as a person. And so you've got to deconstruct that. You've got to say, well, there's no human nature. And of course, as a pastor, I take people to scripture. We talk about, knowing who I am. Well, the fact is sometimes we're confused about who we are. I mean, we're sinful people in a fallen world. Our minds have not escaped the fall. Our feelings have not escaped the fall. And this idea that we would expect 5-year-old girls to understand, quote, who they are,
Yeah.
without help and instruction and modeling is insane. Carl knows this story, and this is going to make him laugh. He brings this up whenever he gets a chance. But my wife and I took a trip. This has been several. You see, he's already laughing because he knows. My wife and I took a trip to Washington D.C. Our daughter lives in that area, and so we get out to D.C. It's only about 2 hours away, and one of our weekend trips we took out there several years ago. I booked a nice hotel in the McLean area, and it just so happened that during that same weekend, there was a furry convention going on. Now, if people don't know what,
Oh,
yeah.
I've always wanted to go to those. One of those.
And so I
Yeah.
walk in, when I pull into the parking lot, I see people walking around outside the hotel in these, animal outfits,
They call it a fursuit.
yeah.
Fursuit.
And so
Yeah.
from the parking lot, I'm taking pictures and texting them to Carl. And so I go in the lobby and it's filled with all these people.
I am dying of laughter at home as I'm getting these things.
we still
Todd Pruitt at a
those
furry
pictures I
convention.
took still find their way around. But there, and it was, it's so ridiculous. You laugh and it's just so silly. But there was a moment during that weekend
Yeah.
that made us really sad, my wife and I, because we got into the elevator at one point, and 3 people joined us on the elevator. Clearly, it was a mom and a dad who were dressed normally, and they had what would have been a very young daughter with them who was dressed as some sort of an animal. And they brought her to this furry convention, no doubt to affirm her. And one of the things that made it so sad was that what this poor girl needed was a mom and dad to say, here's what and who you are. She needed the instruction of what and who you are. And actually, honey, your body tells you a lot about what and who you are. Your body preaches some things to you. And if you don't want to use the word preaches some things, you can say your body tells you some really important things about you. And it also tells you things that are not true about you. 30 years ago, no one hardly needed to say that. Now we do, but there is this confusion. So we do away with human nature. You have some anthropologists in Samoa doing away with human nature, and we think that's just an odd kind of, weirdly motivated anthropologist somewhere. But where we see it is in an elevator in a hotel
Yes.
with a confused pre-adolescent girl who thinks that she just might be an animal. And that's where it's tragic. It goes from ridiculous to being tragic.
This is just some insight. I know for a fact there's going to be parents that are watching this that are interested in this topic because, like I said, I have a 15-year-old and an 11-year-old, and the furry thing is no longer niche.
Right.
This is a big trend right now where you could be a part of like the furry fandom and not identify as an animal at all. But you can also still be interested in the like the fashion statement of it. It's so interesting to me because back in the day that was very niche. Like not only if you were part of the furry community, you most likely had some sort of identification as a different creature, an animal, maybe otherkins. And here's where it gets really, really red flag. Besides what I just said, there's a sexual underbelly to this.
There absolutely is, and everybody
Yes,
knows
there's
it.
a sexual
You saw it in
underbelly.
that hotel.
I didn't know that, actually. That's news to me.
Yeah.
But
Oh yeah. There's.
oh wow.
It's
Okay, gets
very
creepier.
transgressive. It's
Gets
very
creepier.
transgressive.
You can go into a store aimed at tweens and teens, and they will have furry kind of a gear that's sold at a mass production. It's more than a trend. It's a fashion at this point, especially amongst people on TikTok. Social media hasn't helped. So just FYI, this is a very interesting and relevant topic that is gonna,
And
it's gonna evolve.
it's just the fruit of the deconstruction of
Yes.
the illusion of human nature.
This goes back to everything that we're talking about, that this has a genesis, this has an origin, and it's just what Carl and Todd were talking about before, that it really comes from this underbelly of a movement that seeks to deconstruct who you are as a human and reality. And I think that those are the two things that are keep coming up. And Carl, let me bounce it back to you because you mentioned something earlier that I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on, that I find to be very like a trend in almost everything that we're talking about, critical theory. And it's the body. I struggled. I shared this in my book. This is why it was so vulnerable. I struggled with my identity as a female. I thought it was so much better to be a boy. Like, man, you guys have much easier lives. You don't have
It
to
is
worry
much
about
better. It's much better.
It's great to be a man.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, let's not beat around the bush here. Sometimes it's just, now I love my, God, who God made me, but I get it. I really get that struggle. But there's I want to say a discomfort with the body. And it reminds me of like this neo-Gnosticism
Romanticism, where there's this division between who I spiritually am, because that's what played a part with me. And this is where the whole Ralph Waldo Emerson, the New Thought, the Transcendental came in, because it was not just social, it was spiritual. It was, this is what my inner intuition, God, my inner divine, is guiding me and telling me of who I am, not my body. Right. And so I'm wondering if you could speak about this specific concepts, maybe hash out a little bit of the spiritual consequences for this. And just give me your general thoughts to what I just put forth.
Well, first of all, just not really answering your question, but just as a tangent from that, Melissa, I would say to any parents out there, particularly of teenage girls, be aware that teenage girls, time immemorial, have struggled with body image as they're going through puberty. In the 80s and the 90s, the idiom for expressing that was anorexia and bulimia. And we knew that was a problem. And the government and the medical establishment united to make sure that was, I won't say it's been entirely eliminated, but it is no longer the kind of teenage epidemic that it once was.
I had it in my youth group, in one of my youth groups.
Me too. It's cool. That was big.
Today, I think transgenderism has replaced that. There's a rapid, there are different kinds of gender dysphoria, but rapid onset gender dysphoria, which tends to disproportionately affect young girls on the cusp of or going through puberty. We just want to press on any parents listening at this point. If rapid onset gender dysphoria presents itself with your young girls, bear that analogy with anorexia and bulimia in mind and seek help. So that's just a little aside there. I think you're right in saying there is a downgrading of the body here. And I think, again, in some ways, Christianity, certain popular forms of Christianity have not helped here. Because often in Christian circles, we emphasize the soul and forget about the body. One of the things that Catholicism, so sophisticated Catholic theologians have done, and Protestants are only just catching up on, is emphasize the holistic unity of body and soul, and the specific importance of the body to who we are. I've mentioned it many times before in talks, but there's a lovely section in Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval theologian, where he's talking about death and what happens after death. And he says, when you die, your soul goes to be with the Lord, but it is not you, because you are body and soul. So it is not fully and completely you until the day of resurrection.
Wow.
Because you are not just soul. You are soul and body. And I think that's, that points us, when you think about, go back to the idea of human nature. What does it mean to be human? Well, the Westminster Shorter Catechism, of course, says, what is the chief end of man? Man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Think about that answer. And that answer really says that to be human is to have certain end, an ultimate end, glorifying God and enjoying him forever. But we might step back a little and say to be human is to have a whole set of subsidiary ends to that. To be a beaver is to have the end of reproducing other beavers and building dams. And eating. Being a human is much more complicated than that. We have the end of falling in love, having friendships. We don't just go forth and we aren't just the ones, we don't just eat to replace calories like every other creature on the face of the planet. We surround eating with rituals that builds relationships and friendships. We are creatures of multiple ends, all of which culminating in that one great end of glorifying God. But now think about that. When we reject human nature, often what we're doing actually is rejecting given ends. That's what it comes down to. To say there's no such thing as human nature is really to say there are no set of specific ends to which all of those we call human are to conform. And that, I think, then goes to your downplaying of the body, because I would say to you, quite a lot of our ends are physical. What does it mean to be a man? Well, I don't want to get sort of crude on the podcast, but to be a man is to have a certain sexual physiology that fulfills a particular function, unitive and procreative, in the marriage bond. One could say that to be a man, one of the ends of being a man is to fertilize a woman. One of the ends of being a woman is to be fertilized and to gestate and bring the child to term. These are teleological, these are ends we have, and they're intimately connected to the bodies we have. They mean our bodies are not actually just lumps of matter, the particular distinctions between the male and the female body not really mattering. No. The differences between our bodies point to, let's say, differences in our nature, different ends that we have. And then track across to a question you mentioned earlier. Say people seem to be struggling with answering the question, what is a woman? Why do people struggle with that? Because they won't grant that the female body has particular ends. They won't grant that the male body has particular ends. You can gestate, I cannot. I can produce sperm, you cannot. Those differences are teleologically important for understanding who we are. So if we have, as you mentioned, this sort of Gnostic view that who I really am is this kind of spooky thing, let's say, call it the soul, that inhabits this lump of matter like a spaceman inhabits a spacesuit, you're going to end up in all kinds of problems, even down to basics of getting confused over what a man is and what a woman is.
Yeah.
And everything Carl just said can be brought to the church by teachers and preachers, Sunday school teachers, youth leaders, from Genesis chapters 1 through 3.
Yeah.
Everything he just said is in Genesis 1 through 3, particularly 1 and 2, from how our body helps shape our telos, or our end, from procreation to work, productivity. All of those things are part of our givenness as humans.
And I'd make a plug here for Abigail Favale. This year I have the honor of having her as one of my colleagues at Notre Dame. Abigail Favale's book, The Genesis of Gender. Don't endorse every theological point she makes. She's a Catholic and I'm a Protestant. But one thing she does beautifully in that book is bring out the importance of we might say, the spiritual ends of the physical body. I don't know if you had her as a guest, Melissa, but she'd be actually be a wonderful guest on your podcast.
The book is amazing.
She's wonderful.
Protestant ought to read it.
Yeah,
phenomenal. Yeah, I've read Abigail Schreier's book, Love Thy Body, Nancy Piercy, your book.
Yeah.
Like, this is a topic. Yeah, it's not going away.
Abigail Favale, definitely add her to your reading list. She's
Awesome.
quite wonderful.
I'm going to leave a link in the description to find that book as well. And yeah, I think it's just such a relevant topic. And I want to emphasize, this is one thing that I don't want to announce his book beforehand, but Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer, they're writing a book right now called Post Woke. And I got an early copy to read and endorse it. And there's something about this topic, the critical theories, the gender dysphoria, the everything that has to do with critical theory at this point. The things that we're talking about are still so relevant. The race talk. Nobody really wants to lean into this, but this is everywhere. It's not going anywhere. I think that considering the political shift, people are thinking, we've beat it. And I'm over here, maybe I don't want to be cynical, but I'm like, I don't think so. Especially for those who have kids. If you are watching, like we talked about furries before, okay, this is a huge trend that I don't think a lot of Christians realize is big right now. And it's only going to evolve because it's already got a foothold. You're talking millions and millions of views, millions, maybe into the billions at this point on TikTok, which is primarily aimed at your kids. That's exploding with furry fandom. The children's shows. Okay. I don't watch young children's shows anymore because my kids are older. We watch Bluey. I recommend Bluey. Bluey's great.
My granddaughter loves Bluey.
I would watch Bluey even if I don't have kids. And some of them are nice, some of them are fine and they're pretty innocent. They talk about friendship and blah, blah, blah. It's different now if you're watching shows that have been made in the last 3 or so years, as on the Disney Channel, on Nickelodeon. aimed at kids that are talking about, that are emphasizing, that have this undergirding worldview of everything that Carl and Todd are talking about right now. And it's active, it's there, it is present, and it will manifest itself in a different way. So pay attention to this. I would say don't run from it. Maybe this is just some exhortation I'm giving right now, but Todd, let's start with you. We're going to end here in a minute, but uh, I want to bounce off of you anything that I just said. Is there anything you want to add to what I just said? Then we could bounce that same question back to Carl.
Yeah, I mean, what you're naming, these movements are all inherently transgressive, and so they're never going to be satisfied with whatever transgression they're personally in. And so, we're already starting with the younger generation. We're already starting to see where just a simple, you know, transgenderism, a trans man or a trans woman, that's going to be really old fashioned in about 15 or 20 minutes.
You're right.
And what it is now is, like you said, I'm a fairy, or I'm transhuman, or I'm, and so I'm going to wear butterfly wings, or I'm going to wear a tail wherever I go. Because why? Because that's the next transgression. Suddenly, we're going to encounter a time where just being a trans woman or a trans man is going to seem like 1950s, apple pie America, old fashioned,
The 1960s hippie.
that's, it's inherently transgressive, and it's going to keep pushing whatever boundary. I mean, that's why we have to keep adding letters to the LGBTQ thing. I mean, we have to keep adding letters. They have to keep adding stripes and colors to their flag. It's just inherently transgressive in that way. And so I don't want to say that parents have to know every gory detail of everything that's happening, but they need to have a good idea of some of this stuff. And again, pastors too. And I also don't want to make it more complicated in terms of the response. Begin with God's word, begin with Genesis, lay those foundations, start in childhood, with those questions and those answers, telling the better story. I mean, Carl mentioned earlier, we're not necessarily going to argue one person from one position to another, although good apologetic is necessary. But a strong feature of a good, strong apologetic is the story that the Bible tells. We can, I think, at least with a lot of people, we may not be able to out-argue them, but we can out-narrate them with the better story of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. But if we neglect creation and don't, if we rush to redemption without really focusing more than we've ever had to before on creation, then we're going to miss out on a super important opportunity with our kids.
Yeah, that's good to emphasize. Carl, what do you have to add as we close up here?
I would add just two basic practical guidelines. I think what Todd has said pastorally is excellent there. I would say to parents, don't give your kids smartphones.
Yes.
Because that is the access point for the most wicked people in the world to get direct access to your kids.
That's so hard to say, but we have a rule in our house.
Yeah. So no smartphones. And if you're struggling with how to implement that strategy, I would recommend Todd's and my friend Claire Morell's book, The Tech Exits, just come out. Claire is a Christian. The book is not a distinctively Christian book. It's just a good common sense for parents book. And the second thing is, I would say that if you have a child who's wrestling with gender dysphoria or species dysphoria or whatever they call it, with these Therians or whatever, don't suffer alone. Seek help. There are support groups out there. There are other parents going through the same thing. There are other parents who've been through the same thing. So I would suggest, even if your own pastor, and Todd, I felt this times when I was a pastor, I'm sure Todd feels it on occasion, even if your own pastor feels out of depth in terms of being able to give precise expert advice on something, somebody out there will be able to help. So don't suffer alone. Don't suffer in loneliness and isolation. Seek help from others out there who have gone or are going through the same thing. So no smartphones. Seek help.
Yes. Yeah, that's so good. I'm glad that you mentioned that. And yeah, I'll end with mentioning kind of expanding on what you guys are saying here, that the fact that we're even talking about this tells you, if you're struggling with this, that there is support out there. God always rises up people in these times and these days. And I would say to emphatically remember that, like, if you're struggling with this, if there's maybe a child that you have, somebody you know, I would say that there's more people out there than we realize that think that this is a huge problem. The activists are the loudest ones. And we see those numbers on TikTok, right? Where, man, this has like millions and millions of views. Wow, there must be millions and millions of people that are pro trans activism, pro Therian, pro whatever it is. There are more people than you realize, especially parents that who are not Christian, who are not okay with this. So, yeah, just giving you some hope there, letting you know that you're not going to be, somebody's going to call you a name. Somebody's going to, that's what keeps us quiet, right? Is people putting us down, making us sound like we are just the most hateful people in the world. And because we are feelings oriented, sometimes that can be a pull or a draw for us to stay quiet. Don't do that. Don't do that. The enemy wants you to stay quiet. So, gosh, we could go on for a whole other hour because there's so many things to talk about. I would refer everybody, please go check out Mortification of Spin, or is it of Spin or on Spin?
Mortification of spin. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. Check it out, guys. I was so floored and thrilled to find out that this podcast even existed. Carl and Todd are a wealth of information. I, again, will leave a link in the description for you guys to find out. Both of you, I want to thank you guys so much for taking the time to come on my channel today and speaking with me.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having us.